the cosmological argument. A big word, but it just means from the fact of the cosmos. And you get immediately into the concept which everybody understands of cause and effect. Now, it's very foolish when talking to people who are unbelievers and trying to use a cosmological argument to talk about everything must have a cause, because the moment you talk about that, they'll jump up and down on you with golf shoes, and they'll say, no, everything doesn't have to have a cause. That's an assumption. So the Christian should argue from effect to cause. Every effect must have a cause, sufficient and efficient, but you have to have causality. And the fact of a cosmos demands that we have an explanation. That is, if we are following a scientific method of inquiry, such as particular instances, we observe certain things and we come to a general conclusion. Science does this. Philosophy says it does it, and I think that we can say it in a very succinct way. If anything now exists, then something must be eternal. Or something not eternal must have come from nothing, which is a very simple statement of exactly what the cosmological argument is. And what we are arguing for as Christians is the universe as an effect, and what we see around us as an effect, not as the cause in itself. A few years ago, I was debating different people on a national radio program, and I had to debate a gentleman one night who was a scientist, and another one who was an atheist and an agnostic, and I think the fourth member was a cultist. So I had a very friendly audience that night, and I was the guest on the program, and I was representing, quote, Orthodox Christianity, close quote. So they immediately came at me with the idea of, well, how can you prove the existence of God? And I made this statement, which upset quite a few Christians. I said, nobody can prove the existence of God, such as taking the deity into a laboratory, putting a piece of litmus paper into a test tube, and if it changes to purple, God's here. I mean, if you're talking about that kind of proof, forget it, because there are other types of proof, and unfortunately scientists forget that sometimes. What we have to do is re-educate them and show them that they themselves use other kinds of proof in order to arrive at truth, and assumptions and presuppositions. Everybody does. Anybody that tells you that they don't have any presuppositions, you can immediately scratch them off, because everybody has some. And we have, as Christians, a presupposition. We have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth. And because of that, we believe we have found the answer as God has given it. So anyhow, I was going on this program, and I had to brush up on my scientific background to get to this gentleman, because obviously he was very well informed in his field. So I went over and I talked to Dr. Earl U. Bell, who was then at the New York Herald Tribune, a science editor. He's a very famous writer now, and he was beginning to become famous then. And I said, I'd like to bounce off you some ideas on the concept of science and the philosophy of science. He said, go ahead. I said, well, I'm going to be debating somebody tonight. I have to tell you what my reasons are, and I'm going to debate a scientist. And I said, I want to approach him in an area where it's going to be logical, rational, scientifically motivated, and then only philosophical incidentally, that we eventually end up with a philosophical position. He said, all right, I understand what you're talking about. And I said, how many possible explanations are there for the existence of the universe? And I was going right into causality, right into the heart of cosmology, and he's an expert in this field. And Ubel said, well, he said, there are different theories. I said, well, let me give you what I think, and then you criticize it as a scientist. That's the best way to find out. He said, go ahead. I said, number one, the universe is eternal. So we don't really have to worry about it at all. We don't have to ask any questions. It's always been there. So why bother pursuing it any further? And he laughed. And he said, well, that's the theory of Fred Hoyle, the steady state theory. He said, but there's a mountain of evidence accumulating, which incidentally since then has buried it, that the steady state theory won't hold, that we aren't exchanging matter and energy on an equal basis, and therefore the universe is not an eternal existence. He said, I don't think that that's accurate. He said, I think also that Einstein would oppose that. He said, because Einstein affirmed what is called the second law of thermodynamics, which is heat and its loss in friction in the universe. And the argument, of course, goes that the universe was, at its initial creation, very, very hot. It is now cooling down. We know that because in our own solar system we can see that Pluto is solid ice. And it's cooling, so it's losing heat energy by friction. So if it tends toward the loss of energy, you arrive eventually at maximum entropy, which is supreme cold, ultimate cold, and you've lost your capacity to regenerate that energy. Bell said Einstein held that very strongly, and he said the second law of thermodynamics, he said, has not been disproved, and it still stands. So he said, I think that Hoyle has a problem with an eternal universe. He said, I would not subscribe to that. I don't think best scientific evidence indicates an eternal universe. I said, well, we'll scratch that one. The universe is not eternal. I said, no, supposing we look at it from a standpoint that the universe really isn't there at all, but that it exists as a construct or an idea in our minds, and we just think it's there. And so because we think it's there and we perceive that in our thoughts, therefore it exists. He says that's solipsism. That's a big word. It means the only reality that exists is reality within my mind. What I perceive is reality. He said we know that that's not true of the universe. He said because we can predict eclipses. We can predict Halley's Comet, which we've just seen come back again on schedule every 75 years. Unless it hits something on the way around, he said it'll be back. He said you can't predict an illusion. I'll never forget that. You cannot predict an illusion. He said, therefore, to say that the universe is an illusion and doesn't really exist at all, he said, is to deny all scientific data in this area. Well, scratch that one. The universe is not something which exists only because I think it's there or other people think it's there. It has some form of objective reality. And then I said, well, then, how about the universe, I mean, just suddenly appeared spontaneously? I mean, there was a time when it wasn't, and then all of a sudden there was a time when it was. It sort of spontaneously arose out of nothing. And he said, well, he said, that's scientific absurdity. He said, it's a basic law of physics. From nothing, nothing comes. He said, so if you have infinite nothing, you're going to have infinite nothing. That's it. And he said, so the idea that the universe just emerged one day at 6 o'clock in the morning, whatever the date was, out of nothing, he said, is nonsense. I said, well then, how about the universe was created by a force infinitely greater than itself? And he looked at me for a second, and I said, it was created by this force. I said, I'm not saying the God of the Bible. I'm just saying that it was created. He said, well, you're just pushing it back further and further and further. And he said, that's not going to solve it. He said, if you say, as the Big Bang theory does, George Gamo's theory, George Washington University, that the universe was the result of an explosion of hydrogen atoms, compacted together tightly to the size a little larger than a softball, and that then atomic fusion took place and detonation, and it flew forth with an enormous explosion of light and energy. And it's been moving outward from that focal point of explosion approximately anywhere from 8 to 16 billion years ago, they say, at a speed of 186,000 miles per second. It's now slowed down to 25,000 miles an hour, which is the outer rims of the galaxies which we can clock in speed, receding from Earth, from where we are. So, Dr. Bell said, that's the Big Bang theory. And he said it begins with hydrogen atoms. And I said, okay, then there are eternal hydrogen atoms, right? He said, wrong. Because a hydrogen atom is not eternal. Otherwise, you have to start explaining the causes of the hydrogen atom. He said, and you get into the fallacy of what is called infinite regression. You keep going back and back and back and back. And he said, eventually, he said, you would arrive at God, being a theologian. He said, and then I, as a scientist, would say, well, why stop at God? Why, who caused God? And who caused God's God? And who caused, and who caused, and who caused? He said, so you have infinite regression going on. He said, you can't explain the infinite regression. He said, at least to my satisfaction. He said, but the fact that there is a Big Bang, he said, I don't think there's any doubt of that. There was a Big Bang, and there's no such thing as eternal hydrogen atoms. I said, okay, so we're back to there was an explosion and probably of hydrogen atoms. And the hydrogen atoms weren't eternal. Right. I said, then what is eternal? And exactly what we began with, I concluded with in discussing with him. I said, if anything does now exist, then either something must be eternal or something not eternal must have come from nothing. And he just looked at me, and he said, something not eternal must have come from nothing. I said, right. He says, impossible. I said, well, then where are you? But at Genesis chapter 1. The universe was created by a force outside of itself, upon which it must depend. And this we call God, the God of creation. He said, but you've got infinite regression. You can go back to who caused God, and you can go on and on and on and on forever. I said, well, hey, let me ask you a question. I said, supposing we just agreed with Bertrand Russell, that's where you're getting this from, British philosopher, and yourself, that we end up with God after we regress back past the universe. And then we say to God when we arrive there, well, actually, we should regress beyond you. Who made you? And then God would respond to us and say, that is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is I made you, and you are answerable to me. It is an irrelevancy to say who made God once one has arrived at God, because God made us and the universe itself. So stop there. When I was concluding my discussion with Dr. Ubel on the subject, I said to him, well, granting your premises that we finally regress in the cosmos past man, past creation, past the galaxies, and we finally end up with eternal hydrogen atoms, and we go beyond the hydrogen atoms, which we now know are not eternal, and we end up with the creator of the hydrogen atoms. And then we say, God. And then we say to him, well, now we want to know who made you, sir. And the response would be, that's an irrelevancy, because you're answerable to me and I made you. So even if you have a finite God when you get there, which I don't happen to accept, I told him, still when you get there, granting your own premises, you can't answer him. Nor can you go into any argument defending yourself, because you've arrived there. And he's there. What are you going to do then? End of argument. Of course, the Christian doesn't accept this line of reasoning. I was using it to show even the scientific arguments carried to their logical conclusion ends up with a finite creator to whom we are answerable. You see? So the argument of who made God is irrelevant and has no real meaning. But from a Christian standpoint, when you got back to the creator of the atoms, you would not be dealing with an effect. You would be dealing with the cause. And we must restate this again, that the Christian position and the theistic position has always been every effect must have a cause. There's no possible way out of that in reasoning. And when we talk about God, we're talking about the eternal cause. We're not talking about effect. So we can reason back to him. But when we get there, we're dealing with creator, and we're dealing with someone we have to answer to. And that doesn't make it easy at all. Of course, you see, it's very difficult to deal with people like this because Bertrand Russell came to the United States in the 1950s, gave a series of lectures, and Russell was asked by a national magazine. I clipped the article because it fascinated me. And the national magazine said to Russell, Lord Russell, what would you consider to be evidence for the existence of God? That's a fair question. And Russell said, well, I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I don't know if God exists. I don't think he does, but I don't know. But if a voice were to speak to me from heaven and predict without error every event of my life for the next 24 hours, even those outside the normal range of probability, beta principles of mathematics and so forth, then I might be willing to concede the possibility of the existence of a supernatural force. Now, I cite this to show the mentality of some of the greatest minds in the world when it comes to religion and to God. Here's a man that if God talks to him and tells him everything for 24 hours and everything comes to pass exactly as he asked for it, then he's still going to doubt that the Creator is there. And Jesus Christ said, some will not believe. even though one rise from the dead. He rose from the dead, demonstrated himself alive with infallible proofs, and you could say, as Paul did, well, there are 500 witnesses that saw him after his resurrection. Some of them, most of them are still alive. Go talk to them. That's evidence. That's prima facie evidence. But it doesn't make any difference, because there are people whose mindset is, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic, and they're closet atheists. They say they don't know, but they live as if they did. And they're not kidding anybody, least of all God. So in making this appearance on the program that night, I went to Dr. Ubel to try and get a structure inductively for a cosmology, for the existence of God. Now, we haven't proven the God of the Bible. I'm not suggesting that we have. I'm suggesting that we have shown that he is the most probable and reasonable explanation once one goes beyond the creation of hydrogen atoms. And you are face to face with maximum entropy, that the universe is turning cold. Well, it was created then, because it's lost energy, and that energy cannot be made up. So until they disprove the second law of thermodynamics, until they disprove the explosion of hydrogen atoms, loss of heat, till they refute the idea of cause and effect, which they can't, it's just an argument that they use, I think the Christian can very strongly stand upon what the Bible says, that God is the creator, and that we may go back to him. He planted the ear, he planted the eye, he created the human being, which brings us, of course, to the final argument which is used, which I like inductively better than all of them, which is the teleological argument for the existence of God.